morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like, first of all, to thank the CHIK services and Sally Glass in particular for inviting me to share some experience with you in this very exciting journey which you in Australia are about to undertake. I would also like to acknowledge the support of the principal sponsors, well, all of the sponsors, but particularly Doha and Nita for providing the resources to make this happen. We need...
Just one second. This never happens in the ABC thing.
As a humble pediatrician, I always look for interesting images of children. And the next picture is a good example. And it reminds me to ask the question, who's teaching what to who? And who's passing on the disease? Now, I really want to cover four major themes, but this central theme, as we've heard from Jonathan and from Mukesh and Adrian last night, is learning to share. eHealth and the application of eHealth is all about learning to share, and who best to be an advocate as Desmond Tutu. I also want to put the future, what we're doing now and into the future, into some context, some time context. And bear with me while I do that, because it's important, as you'll see as we go through. I want also then to look at what is healthcare going to look like in the future, because we're talking about transformational change and healthcare reform, strengthening healthcare systems in a way that has never happened before. I want to finish with a few thoughts about global societal responsibility, an area that we ignore at our peril, and to end with a quote from Zen, a master of Zen, just to reflect on what we've learned. Once upon a time, as all best stories start, the earth was pristine, was clean, was unpolluted. There was no plastic. There were no people. And you know, it was, I think, 200,000 years ago that the first evidence of the first hunter-gatherers appeared on this globe. And it was not until about 9,000 years ago that farmers and fisheries began in an organized way. And it was 6,000 years ago that people used to cluster into populations, the beginning of urban living, how different it was then from how it is today. And it was 4,000 years ago that man learned how to harness the energy of camels and horses and travel from A to B, to join up other communities who were developing totally separately, but separated by distance. And I want you to think of that as we go through. And it was really only 200 years ago that we began to enter the scientific industrial arena, which is what we have today. So think of it as 200,000 years ago to 200 years ago. That is the logarithmic differential. And it was in 1957 that our first adventures into space with the Sputniks, as they were called then. And of course, we live with all of the trappings of the scientific industrial age today, as illustrated by these pictures. And then what happened to the world of communication? Well, we're all familiar with the use of the telegraph in the 1850s, 1860s, and the earliest telephones in 1882 with Bell, and the radio, which became a ubiquitous means of sharing information, connecting people up together in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And then, of course, we had the early television and the internet, so that the next generation are growing up completely technologically enabled in a way that we, as the previous generation, were not. And we had to learn, and we had to learn fast. And then we moved to the mobile phones. And the picture that I love, which was taken in Mali, in Bamako in Mali in Africa, is this little boy who had a mud mobile phone because he'd seen pictures of it on the TV. Of course, he was chatting into it, 19 to the dozen, having imaginary conversations. But the reality was that he was recognizing that the shape was a communication device and he wanted to use it. So we really are at the beginning of a world which is a global village, where we are all linked up with the capacity to contact each other in a way that was hitherto completely impossible, and we had to travel from A to B to reach our friends and colleagues. We're also entering into what I described the biointelligence age, and what I mean by that is that the major sciences of physical engineering, biological sciences, and information technology are merging. And of course, we're familiar with terms like robotics and biosensors and genomics, etc. But the future is going to be none of those things. It's going to be this list in the beginning. I was being shown the other day in the field of synthetic biology an aerosol spray made by E. coli that you spray on a surface and it fluoresces if you have MRSA in that particular clinical setting. It's all biological, using biological agents to make engineering solutions. Very exciting. We're using biomathematics to analyze defects in the human genome with a sensitivity that was hitherto completely impossible. So we have suddenly opened a door of knowledge, the capacity for which we are only just beginning to understand. I believe the future is going to go in the direction of devices which are powered by our own energy sources within our bodies. I believe we're going to have, hang on. I believe we're going to have chemical reactions in our bodies that we can use to replace energy such that we don't need to replace batteries in devices that we hold in our bodies. I believe we're going to use the kinetic movement of limbs. After all, how does a watch that you all have on your wrist restore its capacity? By the kinetic movements, it simply replenishes its energy source. And we can use body heat and the differentials between body heat to power devices which will help us to understand and to monitor human embedded devices effectively. And that is a vision of one of the applications that I believe will happen in the future. So the take-home messages that I want you to hang on to are, number one, we are moving to healthcare interfaces on mobile phones, because that is the medium that the young understand and that people are using, even in those communities who are illiterate, such as many parts of Africa. I love this quote from Dick Kidney, who's the Dean of Engineering at Imperial. What it means is that you won't enter a treatment plan because you're a diabetic. You will enter a treatment plan because you're you, and you happen to have diabetes amongst the many other things that you need to have monitored. So we're personalizing medicine, and we're personalizing management plans, and we're personalizing treatment modalities in a way that was not possible before. We're also, as we heard this morning from John, we're looking at what are the challenges of a borderless global eHealth network. And this is part of the work that I'll describe in a minute for the Global eHealth Ambassadors Program. If you're an airline pilot and you learn how to fly an airplane in Australia, by international regulatory law, you're allowed to land in Europe or anywhere you want, because there is a convention, the Warsaw Convention, that controls the use of airplanes in different geographies and jurisdictions. Well, it's the same for healthcare, because if you can imagine a global eHealth network, you as a doctor in Australia may be giving advice on a patient in England or Canada or Africa or wherever. And there needs to be a regulatory framework to allow that to happen, and it needs to be global, and it needs to be a convention. Well, you'll be pleased to learn that there is a draft convention presently being written, sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation in America, and it'll be put to the WHO in 2013 for ratification. It's likely to take 5 years to get through the process of every country signing up to it, but it will happen, and it needs to happen if we're going to operate eHealth on a global scale. I personally believe that we are seeing the end of the traditional hospital as we know it, particularly the district general hospitals, which I think are a dead elephant, and I'll explain why. I think we're going to knock them down. And those countries that are building hospitals because that's what they think they ought to do are actually missing a trick. Yungkap Kwankam, who used to head up the WHO Directorate on eHealth, has, I think, a very clear vision of the progression in the last 200 years. It was chemistry in the 19th century that led to the development of the pharmaceutical industry. It was physics in the 20th century that led to the development of imaging and all of the imaging modalities we use routinely today. And it is information and communication technology in the 21st century which will open the door of a knowledge-based, citizen-centric healthcare model, which you've heard about from other speakers. So I think it is correct to say, at last, that we really are at the dawn of the age of citizen-centric healthcare systems. And the fact that you're going to roll out a patient-held electronic health record is an enormously brave and commendable step, because that is where the information repository needs to lie with each of us, you and me, patients. If you look at the traditional healthcare delivery model, it looks like this, and we're all familiar with this, where you have the teaching hospital at the apex of your pyramid, you have regional hospitals, you have district general hospitals, you have general practitioners, and the poor old patients at the bottom of the pile. And when that patient wants to access healthcare services of increasing complexity, he or she has to struggle up this steep slope. Now, this model was conceived by the Egyptians in 3000 BC, and it hasn't changed much since. And do you know what? I think it represents ritual abuse of patients successfully implemented by the medical profession for 6,000 years. You can imagine how many friends as doctors I have left. I think the future model looks much more like this. The first thing you'll see is that the pyramid has become everted, and the specialist expertise is now no longer held within an institution, but is dispersed globally, wherever it happens to be. But the trick is that the knowledge and skills that are concentrated in these specialist clusters, organizations like the Cleveland Clinic, Great Ormond Street, where I work, can now be dispersed not just to fellow healthcare professionals, but directly to informed, wired-up citizens, because they want direct access to specialists. They're no longer happy to be referred through a primary care physician and maybe a regional physician and then eventually ending up with a national specialist service. They want to go straight there, and they've got the information to back up their demands. And I believe that many of the services which were originally locked into these hospitals are going to move now into the retail environment. If you want an X-ray, you can distinguish between the taking of the data with the reading of the data, now with eHealth. So you obviously place the taking of the study, the diagnostic centers, where people are in the daytime, and if the time zones are impossible locally, you get it read in Europe, where it's still daylight, even if it was middle of the night in Australia. So you're using time zones to your advantage as opposed to your disadvantage. So I believe the future model of healthcare will look something like this, where we'll be moving the facilities out of what we traditionally understand as hospitals and clinics, these kind of institutions here, and we will be moving them out into the retail environment, and we'll be passing our knowledge and skills so that healthcare becomes a knowledge industry, and that knowledge can be imparted anywhere you want it to go in the world. If you look at the uptake of IT in healthcare, it's rather a sorry story. In the 1980s, there was an uptake of IT applied to healthcare, but it was sporadic, and it was driven mostly by vendors selling, frankly, into an ignorant and virtually virgin market. And there were some disappointments in the 90s. They were not technical disasters, but they were implementation disasters, because no one really understood what the impact would be of introducing IT to what was traditionally a paper-based environment. And it was Jonathan, I think, who mentioned the ATMs. Remember, ATMs were introduced in 1971 in the globe. And those were the days when those of you who can still remember queued, as Jonathan said, behind the mahogany desk to get cash. And you could only get your cash in banking hours, and you had to stand in the queue. And then this funny thing called an ATM appeared, and you looked at it, and it was located inside the banking hall, so you could only get at it in banking hours. And it was a kind of a nerve-wracking experience if you were brave enough to put your plastic into the hole in the wall, which you thought might consume the plastic and you'd be stuck. And then they migrated these ATMs, and they migrated first to the space between the inner and outer door of the bank, then the wall beside the outer door of the bank. Now you get them in the retail locations, and you and I can go anywhere in the world and get the cash out of a hole in the wall. The younger, as Jonathan again said this morning, the younger generation think we were crazy to queue for cash. Ask them. If you look at what's happening now, so this was the area where there was some disasters. And we're here today. Now, why are we here today? We're here today because we're beginning to understand the power of globalization. We're beginning to interest healthcare economists, because if we see hospitals being torn down, healthcare economists and politicians get excited. Patients love it because the service is coming to them. No longer do they have to struggle to find the services. They get delivered the service wherever they are. And we're obviously using the new applications such as the web, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what was interesting was that from a doctor's point of view, in this area, the healthcare professionals resisted or sat on the fence. And here, when there was the disappointments, they said, oh, I told you so. You shouldn't have done it in the first place. Now, of course, they are beginning to put their power and energy into backing up these reforms. And that's a very exciting step forward. It was Richard Granger, who was the leader of the National Program for IT in the UK, about which I'm not going to say a lot. He said this after, he was exasperated because he was speaking to a large bunch of clinicians who were being obdurate and difficult when he was describing his new box of toys. So he said, he's supposed to have said, I wasn't there, the trouble with you doctors is that you're arrogant, bigoted, refractory, avaricious, conceited, and inherently resistant to change. And a little voice from the back, sadly not me, said, you know, Richard, you're right, on every count, but we're not stupid. And all we want is for you to have consulted us during the design phase. And I implore you, don't make the same mistake. It cost the British taxpayer, me, £12 billion. One of the biggest challenges that we have in every country of the world is the impact of the demographic shift. And as more elderly people are surviving, they are making a hitherto unexpected demand on healthcare services, which by their very nature are limited. And you'll see here that as fertility declines and infectious diseases and mortality declines, you have that against an aging population, and you have the emergence of chronic and non-communicable diseases, which are perfect for long-term eHealth monitoring, telehealth type applications. I've got some slides here prepared by a colleague, Dr. Rifat Atun, who until recently was head of the Global Fund. He's a colleague at Imperial, and he's been looking at what's happening in terms of demographics between countries. You'll see that in more developed countries, the blue line is the over 65, 65s and older, and you've got a growing number of over 65ers with a relatively diminishing birth rate. In less developed countries, that's the middle ground, you have a sort of mixture of the two. You have a rising over 65ers and a kind of muted birth rate increase. But look at this. This is Mexico, where in Mexico you have a rising 65 and olders, but you also have a hugely growing birth rate. And how is it going to be possible to deliver healthcare services to this population, for example? If you look at aging and the cost of care, most money, or a lot of money, is spent in the early 4 years of life, and then you don't spend a lot of money in your health if you're basically healthy, and then the curve starts to rise after 60. Well, of course, there's one obvious solution to this, which is that you introduce compulsory euthanasia at 60 and you take out the problem. Politically, this may be a hard one to sell. So the aging population is a real problem, and it's not a problem only in developed countries, but it's also a problem in developing countries, as you've seen from the Mexican example. And the implications are an extra demand on healthcare services, which are already stretched. And if that's not possible to sustain, which it won't be in any country in the world, then you have to do things differently, and eHealth provides the solution. So the implications of all of this is that health systems are struggling. We need to change the way we're providing care. We need to accommodate the ever more knowledgeable patient. I did a clinic on Friday at Great Ormond Street in the afternoon, and 3 sets of parents arrived with files this thick of information they got about their child's condition. And did I know that a child with a similar condition was being treated with a herbal medicine in Santiago de Chile, and what did I think about that? They wanted a dialogue. They didn't want to be told what to do. They wanted an active, informed discussion so that they could make their decision as to whether to accept my advice or not. And it's a different experience. So there are huge implications of what you are embarking upon, as we've heard, not just from your minister, but others. And I believe the changes are going to be fundamental to the way healthcare services are both accessed from the consumer perspective and also where they're delivered. I think it's going to involve much more use of nurse practitioner type people at the primary care level. I think healthcare training needs to be brought rapidly into the frame. The young undergraduate doctors and nurses should have eHealth in their very pores of their skin. Maybe it'll affect financial remuneration and rewards. Maybe vocation. What kind of people do we want to attract into the caring industry? They're going to have to be IT enabled. And patients who before were kind of passive subcipients of our wisdom are now becoming partners because they have a say. They want a say, and we should give them a say in their healthcare plan. And if you're enlightened as a physician, you become a knowledge broker. You help patients go through that journey because you have some specialist knowledge that can add value. Jean-Claude Healy was a remarkable man, sadly dead, who was headed up the initial eHealth initiatives in initially at the European Commission and then latterly for the WHO. And he said, you know, eHealth is the instrument for productivity gains in what we've got, i.e. making it more efficient, but it also provides the background for the future citizen-centric healthcare environment. And that's what you're going into right now. Many people ask me, what is eHealth? And I'm sure you've been asked the same questions. Well, I think of it in 4 domains, and we're not going to go through this in any detail. Obviously, the clinical applications include the electronic health record, which you're focused on at the moment, video conferencing, telemedicine, clinical decision-making support software, so you make a better decision at the interface between you and your patient in the consult, et cetera, et cetera. The second domain is to keep your healthcare professional body informed as to the latest developments. Half-life of medicine is less than 4 years, sometimes shorter. So you need to have some way of getting that information into the heads of our colleagues. I think we don't utilize the media sufficiently to teach people how to look after their own healthcare needs effectively. And I think this is going to become it's a much underutilized media, as we discovered when we started to use it in Malaysia 10 years ago. And it pays off, because the only thing you're giving them is knowledge. And if you can impart that knowledge effectively, you can change their health care demand profiles, and it's much cheaper for the provider. And finally, I want you to think about a vision. An electronic health record is great. But imagine this. Imagine a blank record being issued to every fetus when the mother's conception is first recognized. Imagine if that record then gets populated with healthcare events to include the antenatal healthcare events. And then you add to it some very interesting additional data. You add the socioeconomic journey of each of us through life. You add your traveling history, so you know when you entered polluted and unpolluted parts of the world. You add your social care aspects. Now you have a very, very rich, longitudinally accumulating the data set for us as an individual, and you log off when you die. And for those of us who believe in the afterlife, maybe we take it with us. But imagine aggregating all of that individual data, a pan-Australian health record, which captures the individual health records, plus all the other data that I've described. And you now start to use that to predict what healthcare trends are going to hit your population 50 years out, 20 years out, 30 years out. It'll make healthcare planning a completely different ballgame. And for me, the holy grail of eHealth is this. That is the one most important thing we should be striving for. Who will be the primary healthcare team of the future? Well, it'll include patients, e-patients. It'll include family and friends who have some experience. It'll include patient web communities who will set up their own talking environments where they can discuss each other's experiences and learn from each other. It'll include nurse practitioners and pharmacists. And I wonder whether the family doctor role will split into two. One of the elements will be a wellness guardian, a caretaker, a preventive person. And the other will be an acute care responsiveness, probably supported by a call center model. This is a very different model from the general practitioners that we're all familiar with. But I believe that that is the direction it will go. So we all need eHealth. This is a guy who's a farmer in New Zealand, and he's got diabetes, and he used to have to drive 150 miles twice a week to the local healthcare center. He now goes once every year because he's using telehealth to manage his diabetes linked into the healthcare center 150 miles away. This is a group of people in the middle of Africa, in Rwanda, who have linked Rwanda's a country we think of genocide, but actually they've done a very interesting project which links educational internet connectivity with healthcare access, healthcare knowledge access. This guy has runs of supraventricular tachycardia, you wouldn't imagine just by looking at him, but actually he's linked up to a transmitter that uplinks the data of his ECG 24/10 to a satellite, which downloads it to a healthcare center, and he's monitored to see if he gets any runs of SVT. He gets alerted on his mobile phone, and he pops a pill. So you can take pictures endlessly of people, and they all need eHealth. Even the poorest rural communities in India need eHealth because they don't have access to healthcare services, but eHealth can bring them that access. So even in the poorest of the rural communities in India, they need our help. This is all to do with sharing. So if you think about global health, we'll now move to what are the bigger picture, which was introduced by Desmond Tutu just now. And you see in the 1960s, people used to talk about tropical medicine. And there were some early efforts to try and strengthen healthcare systems in the more underserved populations of the world. And then in the 1990s, we started talking about international health, and the WHO began to take an active interest in what was happening internationally. And then in the 1990s, we had global health, and now we're looking at a potential economic recession of much bigger proportions than we have at the moment. And what impact, do we ask ourselves, is that going to have on the aid-funded healthcare initiatives around the globe? Because they are putting aid into supporting an old model, the model which we're familiar with. And the interesting thing is, however much money you throw at healthcare issues, HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, etc., and a huge amount of money is being spent to support the underserved parts of the world, the Millennium Development goals, which were set some years ago, are not being reached. This was sub-Saharan Africa and their deaths per 1,000 live births in a logarithmic scale. The Millennium Development goals predicted that by 2015, this would reduce to about 60. But actually, what's happening is that it hasn't made much impact in spite of all that money. And the problem is that if there is a global recession, one of the consequences is likely to be that aid money will disappear. And what will happen is that huge new populations of people will fall below the critical level in the terms of funding. So the new challenges in global health are to do something about the needless deaths. One example, obviously with me being a pediatrician, is the children. 10 million children die every year. And most of them die from preventable diseases because of weak healthcare systems. And I think we have a responsibility to address these appalling human figures. So what will success look like? How will we judge whether we're making any progress globally? I'm talking globally, not just in Australia. And the answers I've listed here, I'm not going to read all of them, but there's one I want you to see, which is that country after country after country is starting to implement e-health strategies in an attempt to address the issues that we've discussed. But they're still far too few, and it needs to accelerate, which is one of the drivers behind the Global eHealth Ambassador program that I'm working on with Archbishop Tutu. And if you see from this list, there's actually an encouraging number of initiatives that have been going on for the last 4 or 5 years, including the World Health Assembly, and we now have just beginning the rollout of the Global eHealth Ambassador program, which I'll talk to you about in a sec. But as Richard used to remind us, what we have now is this. And this is actually a well-known hospital in the UK, still using paper files. If you look around the big institutions and the NGOs of the World Health Organization has an e-health strategy. The European Community has an e-health strategy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So e-health has become a core preoccupation of governments around the world. Now, I said I'd talk a little bit about the Global eHealth Ambassador program, which is chaired by Archbishop Tutu, and what a wonderful leader to have to put his name, reputation, and his face on an initiative as important as this. The model is that there are 12, we've appointed 6, we haven't appointed the other 6 yet. There will be 12 respected opinion formers, globally representative, each of whom having a different constituency of influence, and in a powerful enough position to influence health policy of a country. And the appointment is for 3 years. And the mission is to utilize every opportunity to accelerate the uptake of e-health and to strengthen national healthcare systems with a view to improving healthcare outcomes. Exactly the same aspiration that you have in Australia, which we've heard about from your minister. But particularly to focus on bringing medical knowledge and skills to the underserved, to the countries that simply don't have access to the resources that other countries are fortunate to have. The Secretariat is in Archbishop's office in South Africa and also at Imperial College, and it's being funded by the Gulbenkian Foundation and also by Microsoft, but others are joining. And the activities which we've mentioned are listed here, but it's a very early stage of a major global initiative which we hope will accelerate the uptake of IT, the rollout of e-health, and will be eventually able to achieve better healthcare outcomes for the areas in which it's going to be influential. And also, and very importantly, to be the voice of those in need. This last bullet. So we believe that if we can apply this and link it to large-scale e-health projects, we can accelerate the normal evolutionary period, evolutionary curve of implementing e-health services. And I think you've heard from other people before me that the challenges are not the technology challenges, because the technologies we're using have been applied to other industries for years. The challenges are people like you and me. How do we overcome years of embedded and ingrained practice and do things fundamentally differently? And that is a huge challenge. I'm reminded of Darwin, who said it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one that is most responsive to change. That is the journey you have ahead of you, and that is where your leadership needs to come from. And it's scary. It's scary. No one has before tried to change a global sector as important of healthcare in such a transformational way. And there are many challenges that have to be identified in advance and avoided, and pitfalls. I want to finish by just asking you some philosophical questions of yourself. Today, as we sit here on the 28th of March, 2012, 30,000 children will die from totally preventable diseases. If we don't help them, who will? I believe that when history looks back at our generation, we will be found culpable. Why? We have globally threatening events happening around us all the time. Pollution and waste, global warming, social unrest, on an unprecedented scale, 57 zones of war around the world today. Child soldiers, 300,000, most of them boys. Widespread migration abuse, 20 million children are displaced. These are all pediatric figures because I'm familiar with them, but you can extrapolate it to adults as well. You have a north-south economic divide. You have the prospect of a catastrophe recession, still not perhaps understood. Why are we ignoring this? Why aren't we responding? Why, as we, as a generation, why are we not responding to these challenges, which threaten our globe? They threaten our children's future. Is it because we're ignorant? No, it can't be. Are we disinterested? Why? Are we short-sighted? Probably. Are we greedy? Yes. Are we demonstrating a lack of responsibility for our children and grandchildren and their children in turn? And I think the answer is yes. We're not really focusing on the problem. I want to finish with some Zen. You know, the ultimate, this is, I think, should be the eHealth mantra. The fundamental delusion of humanity is to suppose that I am here and you are there. Remember to think outside of the box and to be prepared for anything, but stick with it because you can't afford not to. Above all, learn to share. Thank you very much.
I honestly think that CHIK gather together the best speakers on this topic in the world. Would you agree with me? My time is up, but this passionate man is so interesting. I'm going to take one or two quick questions. Thank you. Do you mind just standing and introducing yourself?
Chris Mitchell. Look, I just wanted to flesh out a little bit of some of my concerns around your presentation. It was a fantastic presentation. Australia has a focus on eHealth, but also on primary care. And some of the comments around primary care and the important filtering role of primary care, I guess I was a little bit concerned around. I think Barbara Starfield has pretty well established the important filtering role that primary care has, and in fact her position is the most important thing a GP can do is keep people away from specialists. Chris Forrest has shown that people who see a primary care physician first have a 50% reduction in hospitalisations. And Peter Frank showed us that people whose primary care provider is a GP or a primary care physician have a 33% lower cost of care and have got a 19% lower reduced risk of dying. And I guess what I want to see is a future that eHealth actually supports that important filtering role, because a lot of the cost blowouts that you're seeing, particularly in Africa, actually relate to a whole lot of specialist services that are coming in to address problems like HIV/AIDS, rather than actually building up the primary care system that will support holistic care for people. So I'd appreciate your comments.
The questions are as good as the presentations, ladies and gentlemen.
What about the answer? I've got one. First of all, I am a strong supporter of primary care. I've got 2 GPs myself, and I can choose between which one I go for what. And I think the role of the primary care physician and the nurse specialist is absolutely critical as a filtering mechanism. What I am saying, however, is that I think the role will change. I'm not saying that there'll be no more family doctors, because I believe the GP model is a very good one. But I think that the role will change, and it won't remove the referral, the filtering role, but it will be differently staffed on the model that I've described above. So I think we need to think slightly out of the box and use our GPs in a different way, and I think that will be beneficial for patients.
Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately time forbids me from taking more questions, but I ask you to give Ricky Richardson a warm round of applause. Thank you.